He didn't shower. His beard was tangled with crumbs and dirt. He stank of animals and unwashed flesh. His fingernails were black with grime, his teeth rotted yellow stumps. And yet, the most beautiful women in Imperial Russia fought to be near him. Countesses threw themselves at his feet. The Empress of all Russia hung on his every word. Men who commanded armies trembled at his glance. This is the story of Grigori Rasputin, the filthy peasant whose strange powers and darker appetites nearly brought down an empire. A man who claimed to speak to God while wallowing in the deepest sins of the flesh. But to understand why the fate of Imperial Russia rested in the hands of a madman, we must start in a frozen village in Siberia, where something evil was born in the endless winter. January 21st, 1869. In the village of Pokrovskoye, deep in the Siberian wilderness, a child entered the world screaming. The midwives would later whisper that his cries sounded like something inhuman. E.F.I.M. Rasputin was a farmer, like his father before him. His wife Anna was a devout woman who crossed herself whenever thunder rolled across the steppes. They were simple people, bound to the soil by poverty and the brutal Siberian climate. Winter in Pokrovskoye lasted 8 months. Temperatures plunged to 40 below zero. The nearest city lay 300 miles through trackless forest. Here, in this isolation so complete it could drive men mad, young Grigori Rasputin learned to survive. There was no school in Pokrovskoye. The boy could not read or write. But the villagers noticed something unusual about Efim's son. Animals that were dying seemed to recover after the strange child touched them. Horses grew calm when he whispered in their ears. His parents were devout members of the Russian Orthodox Church, but their son's interests lay elsewhere. While other children played, Grigori watched the Straniki, the holy wanderers who occasionally passed through their village, carrying mysterious knowledge from distant monasteries. These wandering mystics spoke of visions, of direct communion with the divine. They claimed that true holiness could only be achieved through suffering, and through embracing sin so completely that redemption became possible. Young Rasputin listened to every word. The other villagers began to whisper. There was something wrong with the Rasputin boy. Something in his eyes that made grown men look away. Something that suggested he could see things that others could not. In 1889, at age 20, Grigori married Praskovia Dubrovina, a local girl known for her quiet piety. She would bear him 3 children. For a brief moment, it seemed the strange young man might settle into ordinary village life. But domesticity could not contain whatever burned inside Grigori Rasputin. His neighbors reported that he would disappear for days at a time, returning with wild stories of visions and voices. He spoke of angels appearing to him in the forest, of divine missions that called him away from home. Then, in 1891, everything changed. Rasputin abandoned his wife and children without warning. He had become a Stranik, one of Russia's wandering holy men, seeking salvation through pilgrimage and spiritual extremes. For the next decade, he would walk thousands of miles across Russia, visiting monasteries and holy sites. At the Verkhoturya monastery, monks reported that the peasant from Siberia displayed an unusual intensity in prayer. But they also noticed something disturbing. Rasputin had developed his own interpretation of Orthodox theology. He believed that sin and salvation were intimately connected. To truly repent, he claimed, one must first sin completely. Only by embracing every form of wickedness could the soul achieve perfect contrition. It was a dangerous philosophy, and it began to manifest in disturbing ways. Fellow pilgrims reported that Rasputin would preach about spiritual ecstasy while engaging in acts that scandalized even hardened travelers. He claimed his sexual encounters were forms of prayer. Yet despite his increasingly bizarre behavior, people were drawn to him. There was something hypnotic about his presence, something that made rational individuals abandon their better judgment. Even the most pious monks found themselves listening when the mad peasant spoke of his visions. By 1900, word of the strange mystic was spreading through Russia's religious communities. Stories traveled from monastery to monastery, a wild man from Siberia who could heal with a touch, who claimed direct communication with God, who preached salvation through sin. The stage was set for Grigori Rasputin to enter the highest circles of Russian society. All he needed was an invitation to hell. St. Petersburg, 1905. The jewel of the Russian Empire gleamed with wealth and power, but beneath the surface, cracks were spreading. Tsar Nicholas II ruled over a nation in chaos. Military defeats, economic crisis, and revolutionary violence threatened the very foundations of Imperial Russia. In the Alexander Palace, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna lived in constant terror, not of revolutionaries or foreign enemies, but of a medical condition that could kill her only son at any moment. Tsarevich Alexei, heir to the Russian throne, suffered from hemophilia. A minor bump could trigger internal bleeding that no doctor could stop. The boy's life hung by a thread so thin that his mother barely slept. Into this desperate situation walked a figure from a nightmare. Grigori Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg, dirty, unkempt, and radiating an otherworldly presence that both repelled and fascinated the capital's elite. Russian high society was already fascinated by mysticism and the occult. Seances were fashionable. Noble ladies collected fortune-tellers like jewelry, but they had never encountered anything like the wild man from Siberia. He was introduced to influential circles by Militsa and Anastasia, the so-called Montenegrin princesses, who were obsessed with spiritualism. They vouched for Rasputin's miraculous powers, claiming he could heal the sick and predict the future. The first meeting between Rasputin and the imperial family occurred in November 1905. The empress was initially repulsed by his appearance and crude manners, but desperation made her willing to try anything to save her son. What happened next would be debated for over a century. During one of Alexei's bleeding episodes, when court physicians had given up hope, Rasputin was summoned to the palace. He entered the boy's room, knelt beside the bed, and began to pray. Within hours, the bleeding stopped. The child's fever broke. By morning, Alexei was sitting up, asking for food. The doctors could offer no medical explanation. Whether through divine intervention, hypnosis, or sheer coincidence, Rasputin had achieved the impossible. He had saved the life of the future Tsar. From that moment, he owned the gratitude and terror of the most powerful woman in Russia. The Empress began to believe that God had sent her a guardian angel in the most unlikely form. She started calling Rasputin our friend and insisted that her husband treat the peasant mystic with respect bordering on reverence. But others in the court were horrified. How could a filthy, uneducated peasant wield such influence over the rulers of the Russian Empire? The very foundation of aristocratic society seemed under attack by this walking contradiction. Rasputin seemed to feed on their disgust. He deliberately emphasized his crude origins, spitting on palace floors, wiping his hands on expensive furniture, and speaking in coarse peasant dialect even in the presence of royalty. Yet his hold over the imperial family only grew stronger. Every time Alexei fell ill, Rasputin appeared. Every time he prayed over the boy, the crisis passed. It was as if he held the future of the Romanov dynasty in his unwashed hands. By 1910, Rasputin had become the most sought-after figure in St. Petersburg society. Invitations to meet the Holy Devil were treasured like imperial decorations. But those who spent time with him discovered that his magnetic presence came with a terrible price. He would arrive at aristocratic salons unwashed and stinking, his beard matted with food scraps. Yet within minutes he would have the most refined ladies in the empire hanging on his every word, competing for his attention like schoolgirls. Witnesses described his eyes as the most unsettling feature. They seemed to burn with an inner fire, capable of piercing through all pretense and social armor. Grown men claimed they felt naked under his stare, as if he could see their deepest secrets. The rumors began almost immediately. Countesses were seen leaving his modest apartment at dawn, their reputations in ruins but their obsession undiminished. Even nuns from nearby convents reportedly sought private audiences with the wild mystic. Rasputin's philosophy of salvation through sin provided the perfect justification for these encounters. He convinced his followers that sexual ecstasy was a form of prayer, that by surrendering their bodies to him, they were offering themselves to God. But what gave him such power over rational, educated people? Modern psychologists suggest several possibilities. His penetrating stare might have been a form of hypnosis. His crude confidence could have been psychologically dominant in a society bound by rigid etiquette. Others believe his secret lay in his complete lack of shame. In a world where every gesture was governed by social rules, Rasputin's absolute freedom from convention made him seem almost godlike to those trapped by propriety. Whatever the mechanism, the results were undeniable. Married women abandoned their families for a chance to spend time with him. Wealthy patrons showered him with gifts. Even his enemies admitted that his presence was overwhelming. The scandal reached new heights when newspapers began publishing exposés. Tabloids printed lurid accounts of orgies in his apartment, of noble ladies participating in twisted religious ceremonies that resembled pagan rituals more than Christian worship. The Orthodox Church was outraged. How could a man who claimed to be a holy elder engage in such debauchery? But every attempt to investigate Rasputin was blocked by imperial protection. The Empress would not allow her son's savior to be persecuted. Meanwhile, Rasputin's influence over state affairs continued to grow. The Empress consulted him on matters of policy, military appointments, and even international relations. A Siberian peasant who could barely read was helping to run the largest empire on earth. His enemies multiplied with each passing scandal. Conservative nobles saw him as a threat to the traditional order. Liberal politicians viewed him as proof of the monarchy's corruption. Religious leaders condemned him as a blasphemer, but none could touch him while he remained under imperial protection. And through it all, Rasputin seemed to revel in the chaos he created. He had discovered that in a world obsessed with respectability, the most shocking transgression was complete honesty about human nature's darkest impulses. As World War I devastated Russia, Rasputin's political influence reached its peak. With Tsar Nicholas at the front commanding his armies, Empress Alexandra effectively ruled the empire, and she ruled according to the advice of her holy friend. The results were catastrophic. Ministers were appointed and dismissed based on Rasputin's whims. Military strategies were influenced by his supposed divine visions. Government policy reflected the prejudices and ignorance of an uneducated peasant mystic. Prime Minister Ivan Goromykin was dismissed because Rasputin disliked him. War Minister Alexei Polivanov was forced out after crossing the holy man. Even members of the Tsar's own family watched helplessly as their advice was ignored in favor of mystical nonsense. The Russian people began to lose faith in their rulers. How could they trust a government that took orders from a debauched peasant? Revolutionary sentiment, already dangerous, reached a boiling point as stories of Rasputin's influence spread. Opposition newspapers published increasingly violent attacks on both Rasputin and the imperial family. Political cartoons depicted the Empress as his willing slave. Some went further, suggesting that the German-born Alexandra was using her mystic to betray Russia to the Kaiser. Conservative politician Vladimir Purishkevich delivered a famous speech to the Duma, Russia's parliament, declaring that the empire would fall unless it was freed from the dark forces surrounding the throne. His words were both prophecy and call to action. Members of the royal family tried desperately to convince Nicholas and Alexandra to banish Rasputin. Grand Duke Nikolai Mikhailovich wrote directly to the Tsar, warning that the dynasty's survival depended on ending the scandal. His letter was ignored. Even more moderate politicians began to see Rasputin as an existential threat to Russia itself. Liberal leader Pavel Milyukov asked in a famous parliamentary speech, "Is this stupidity or treason?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. But Alexandra would not abandon the man she believed had been sent by God to save her son. Every attempt to remove Rasputin was met with hysterical resistance from the Empress, who threatened to have her husband abdicate rather than lose her friend. The deadlock created a powder keg. Rasputin's enemies realized that, as long as he lived, he would control the imperial family. And as long as he controlled the imperial family, Russia would continue its descent into chaos and defeat. Among the growing opposition, a conspiracy began to form. It included some of the most prominent names in Russian society, aristocrats who valued their country more than their loyalty to the crown, patriots who saw murder as the only path to salvation. Secret meetings took place in elegant, hushed rooms where desperate men made desperate plans. They convinced themselves that killing Rasputin would save Russia. They had no idea that his death would only accelerate the empire's collapse, creating a martyr whose legend would prove more dangerous than the man himself. July 12, 1914. Grigori Rasputin had returned to his home village of Pokrovskoye in Siberia, hoping to escape the mounting pressure in the capital. But his enemy's reach extended even to the remote Siberian steppes. The peaceful village street was about to be shattered. Kionia Guseva was a former prostitute turned religious fanatic. She had been twisted by the radical teachings of a defrocked priest named Sergei Trufanov, who preached that Rasputin was literally the Antichrist walking among men. She had traveled hundreds of miles for one purpose, to kill the man she believed was leading Russia to damnation. She carried a knife blessed by her mad prophet, convinced that divine will guided her mission. Rasputin was walking to the village post office when she struck. The blade went deep into his abdomen, nearly disemboweling him. As blood poured from the wound, Guseva screamed, "I have killed the Antichrist!" For several hours it appeared she had succeeded. Rasputin lay near death, his intestines exposed, loss of blood making survival seem impossible. The local doctor prepared for the worst, sending word to St. Petersburg that the holy man was dying. But once again, Rasputin defied death itself. Through sheer will or divine intervention, he began to recover. Within weeks, he was walking again. Within months, he had returned to the capital, his survival adding new layers to his legend of invincibility. The assassination attempt had several profound effects. First, it convinced Rasputin's followers that he was truly blessed by God. What mortal man could survive such a wound? Second, it made him increasingly paranoid about his safety. But most importantly, it demonstrated that his enemies were willing to kill. The gloves were off. From this point forward, the struggle for control of Russia would be fought with knives and bullets, rather than words and political pressure. When war broke out just days after the attack, some saw divine symbolism. Rasputin had opposed Russia's entry into the conflict, predicting that it would bring disaster to the dynasty. His near death seemed to parallel his country's approaching doom. From his hospital bed, Rasputin sent desperate telegrams to the Tsar, begging him not to go to war. If Russia fights, he warned, it will be the end of everything. His words would prove prophetic. The failed assassination had created a martyr while leaving the man alive. Rasputin returned to St. Petersburg more convinced than ever of his divine mission, more reckless in his behavior, and more dangerous to the stability of Imperial Russia. His enemies learned a crucial lesson. If they wanted to kill Grigori Rasputin, they would need to be much more thorough. The next attempt would leave nothing to chance. Prince Felix Yusupov owned one of the most beautiful palaces in St. Petersburg. Heir to a fortune larger than the Tsar's, he was cultured, intelligent, and utterly convinced that Rasputin was destroying Russia. By December 1916, he had decided that murder was the only solution. Yusupov was not alone in his conspiracy. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, cousin to the Tsar, provided royal legitimacy to the plot. Vladimir Purishkevich, the parliamentary firebrand, offered political justification. Dr. Stanislaus Lazovert would provide the poison. Their plan seemed foolproof. Yusupov would invite Rasputin to his palace under the pretext of introducing him to his beautiful wife, Princess Irina. Once there, they would serve him wine and cakes laced with enough potassium cyanide to kill several men. December 30th, 1916. Just after midnight, Yusupov arrived at Rasputin's apartment. The holy man was dressed in his finest clothes, a silk shirt, velvet trousers, and shiny new boots. He was excited about meeting the famous princess. They drove through the snowy streets to the Yusupov palace. In the basement, an elegant table had been set with wine, tea, and petit fours. Every item was deadly. The conspirators waited upstairs, barely able to contain their nervous excitement. What happened next defied all logic. Rasputin consumed the poisoned cakes with apparent relish. He drank multiple glasses of contaminated wine. According to every medical textbook, he should have died within minutes. But nothing happened. He continued talking, laughing, even asking for more refreshments. Yusupov watched in growing horror as enough poison to kill a dozen men had no effect whatsoever on his intended victim. Hours passed. Upstairs, the other conspirators grew impatient. Why was Rasputin still alive? Had their poison been defective? Or was the mad monk's reputation for supernatural resilience actually true? Finally, in desperation, Yusupov excused himself and ran upstairs to get Grand Duke Dmitry's revolver. He returned to find Rasputin examining a crystal crucifix, apparently in a religious trance. "You'd better look at the crucifix and say a prayer," Yusupov whispered. As Rasputin turned, the prince fired a single shot into his chest. The holy man collapsed to the floor, blood spreading across the fine carpet. The conspirators rushed downstairs to confirm their success. Rasputin lay motionless, his eyes closed, no sign of breathing. Dr. Lazovert checked for a pulse and found none. They had finally killed the unkillable man. But as they planned disposal of the body, something impossible happened. Rasputin's eyes suddenly opened. He grabbed Yusupov by the throat and hauled himself to his feet, whispering, "Felix, Felix, Felix!" In panic, Yusupov broke free and ran. Behind him, he heard the heavy footsteps of the man he had just murdered. Rasputin was not only alive, he was pursuing his attackers through the palace corridors. The wounded man reached the courtyard and began crawling toward the gate, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Purishkevich appeared and fired 4 more shots at point-blank range. Finally, mercifully, Rasputin stopped moving. But even then, the conspirators took no chances. They wrapped the body in chains, loaded it into a car, and drove to the frozen Neva River. Through a hole in the ice, they pushed Grigori Rasputin into the dark water below. Russia's most mysterious man had finally met his match. Or so they thought. 3 days later, Rasputin's body was found frozen in the Neva River. What the autopsy revealed would fuel conspiracy theories for over a century. Had the conspirators actually succeeded in killing him? Or had something else claimed his life in the icy water? The official autopsy report stated that Rasputin had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. But this directly contradicted the conspirators' own accounts, which describe multiple shots to the chest and abdomen. The official autopsy report stated that Rasputin had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. But this directly contradicted the conspirators' own accounts, which describe multiple shots to the chest and abdomen. Even more disturbing were the rumors that began circulating immediately. Some claimed that water had been found in Rasputin's lungs, suggesting he had still been alive when thrown into the river. Others insisted that his frozen arms showed signs of trying to escape his bonds. Dr. Dmitry Kosaratov, who performed the autopsy, privately told colleagues that the body showed signs of having been alive when it entered the water. If true, this meant Rasputin had survived poison, multiple gunshot wounds, and severe beating, only to drown beneath the ice. The toxicology report added another layer of mystery. Despite the conspirators' claims of using massive amounts of potassium cyanide, no poison was found in Rasputin's stomach. Had they lied about using poison, or had his body somehow neutralized the deadly chemicals? Modern medical experts have suggested several possibilities. The cyanide might have been too old to remain potent. The sugar in the cakes could have absorbed much of the poison, or Rasputin's chronic stomach problems might have created an acidic environment that neutralized the toxin. But rational explanations could not compete with the power of legend. Within days of the body's discovery, stories spread through Russia about the holy devil who had refused to die. Some claimed he had cursed his killers with his last breath. The newspapers, freed from government censorship by the chaos following the murder, published increasingly sensational accounts. Headlines screamed about the indestructible monk and the devil who walked among men. International press picked up the story, spreading tales of Rasputin's supernatural resilience around the world. The man who had been merely notorious in life became genuinely legendary in death. Perhaps most significantly, the confusion surrounding his death overshadowed an uncomfortable truth. The autopsy found no evidence of the sexual organs that had supposedly been so central to his power. Another mystery to add to the collection. In the end, it didn't matter exactly how Grigori Rasputin died. What mattered was how the story of his death became more powerful than the reality of his life. The man was gone, but the legend was just beginning. The conspirators who killed Rasputin believed they were saving Imperial Russia. Instead, they had administered the final blow to a dynasty already mortally wounded. Within weeks of the murder, revolution swept through the capital. Far from stabilizing the monarchy, Rasputin's death eliminated the only man who might have convinced Alexandra to make necessary compromises. Without her holy friend's calming influence, the empress became even more rigid and hysterical. Tsar Nicholas II, already overwhelmed by military disasters, lost his final source of domestic stability. The imperial couple had depended on Rasputin not just for medical intervention, but for emotional support in their isolated, paranoid world. The murder's aftermath revealed the true extent of Rasputin's influence. Government ministers who had been appointed on his recommendation were dismissed en masse. Military officers who had crossed him were suddenly promoted. The entire structure of imperial governance had been built around the whims of a dead peasant. Prince Felix Yusupov was briefly arrested, but quickly released due to his royal connections. Grand Duke Dmitry was exiled to the Persian front, a punishment that probably saved his life, as he was far from Russia when the Bolsheviks began executing royalty. The Russian people's reaction to Rasputin's death was mixed. Some celebrated the removal of the dark force that had corrupted their rulers, but others saw his murder as proof that the nobility cared nothing for the common man, even a holy one. More ominously, Rasputin had reportedly made several prophecies about what would happen after his death. He supposedly predicted that, if he were killed by nobles, the entire royal family would die within 2 years. Events would prove him terrifyingly accurate. March 15, 1917, less than 3 months after Rasputin's murder, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated his throne. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty collapsed not with a bang, but with a whimper. By July 1918, Bolshevik revolutionaries had murdered the entire imperial family in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Tsar, Tsarina, and all their children were shot and bayoneted to death. Rasputin's prophecy had come true with chilling precision. But the Holy Devil's influence didn't end with the dynasty's fall. Communist propagandists used his memory as proof of imperial corruption. They portrayed him as the embodiment of everything evil about the old regime: superstition, sexual depravity, and contempt for the people. Yet even his enemies couldn't diminish the power of his legend. Stories about Rasputin spread across the world, growing more fantastic with each telling. He became the ultimate symbol of mysterious power, of the thin line between holiness and evil. Historians have spent over a century trying to separate fact from fiction in Rasputin's story. Did he really have healing powers? Was he a German spy? A sexual predator? A genuine mystic? The truth may be buried forever beneath layers of propaganda, gossip, and myth. What remains undeniable is his impact on history. A barely literate peasant from the Siberian wilderness had helped bring down one of the world's largest empires. His fingerprints were on every disaster that befell Imperial Russia in its final years. The Rasputin affair also revealed something disturbing about power itself. How could rational, educated leaders fall so completely under the influence of such an obviously flawed individual? The answer suggests uncomfortable truths about human nature and the corruption that comes with absolute authority. Grigori Rasputin's death marked the end of his earthly influence, but the beginning of his cultural immortality. Within years of the revolution, his story had spread across the globe, inspiring countless works of fiction, music, and film. Hollywood discovered Rasputin in the 1920s, producing films that had little connection to historical reality, but everything to do with box office appeal. He was portrayed as everything from a romantic figure to a supernatural villain, depending on what audiences wanted to see. The disco era gave birth to perhaps the most famous cultural tribute, Boney M's Rasputin, which introduced his legend to a new generation through infectious rhythms and wildly inaccurate lyrics. Ra-Ra Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen, became a global phenomenon. Modern entertainment has only intensified the fascination. Video games feature him as a mystical boss character. Netflix series explore conspiracy theories about his death. Social media influencers debate whether his powers were real or imagined. But perhaps most significantly, Rasputin has become shorthand for a specific type of dangerous influence, the outsider who gains mysterious power over authority figures through some combination of charisma, cunning, and psychological manipulation. Politicians warn about advisors with Rasputin-like influence over their opponents. Business analysts describe consultants who wield disproportionate power behind the scenes. The name itself has become a warning about the corruption of power by unworthy hands. This cultural persistence reveals something profound about Rasputin's story. It touches on universal fears about charlatans and false prophets, about the vulnerability of power to manipulation, about the thin line between spiritual insight and dangerous delusion. In an age of social media influencers, conspiracy theorists, and alternative facts, Rasputin's story feels remarkably contemporary. The mechanisms he used, exploiting desperation, promising impossible solutions, using scandal to increase rather than decrease his influence, remain recognizable today. Today, the village of Pokrovskoye still exists on the Siberian steppes. Tourists come seeking traces of the man who was born there over 150 years ago. They find a museum, some old photographs, and endless speculation about what really happened in those final, chaotic years of Imperial Russia. But the mystery of Grigori Rasputin cannot be solved by visiting his birthplace or examining historical documents. It lies deeper than facts, in the uncomfortable questions his story raises about human nature itself. How does a man with no education, no social position, and no conventional power gain influence over an empire? Why do rational people abandon logic when confronted with charismatic confidence? What makes us vulnerable to those who promise to solve our most desperate problems? The answers are as relevant today as they were in 1916. In every generation, Rasputins emerge, figures who exploit our deepest fears and desires, who promise salvation while delivering chaos, who gain power by understanding human weakness better than we understand it ourselves. Was Grigori Rasputin truly a mystic, blessed with powers beyond science? Or was he simply the most dangerous manipulator in Russian history, a man who understood instinctively how to exploit the desperate and the powerful alike? Perhaps the truth lies buried beneath the Siberian snow, in a village where winter lasts 8 months, and strange children are sometimes born under the endless stars. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and more terrifying, that every age produces its own Rasputin, and ours may yet be waiting in the shadows.
If history leaves you curious and craving more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Join us on the journey through time, one forgotten echo at a time.